Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to 20th Century Revolutions. Episode 2.13, Young Turks in Exile. Last time, we traced the origins of the Committee of Union and Progress, as the organization was first founded by medical students in Istanbul angry about new censorship at their school. And as we saw, this early movement gained more and more traction throughout the early 1890s, so that by 1895, when the crisis surrounding the Hamidian massacres had made Abdul Hamid's government increasingly vulnerable, many began to feel that the Sultan was inevitably going to be deposed, either through the intervention of one of the great powers or through a palace coup organized by the newly established Committee of Union and Progress. But Abdul Hamid, who was now in his 20th year as Sultan, had at this point become a real master at international diplomacy and internal politicking. So the Sultan managed to make it out of the crisis with his rule still very much intact. For the CUP, this triumph of the Sultan meant the temporary disillusionment of oppositional politics in the imperial capital. Because beginning in 1895, a huge investigation was launched into the activities of student radicals at the royal colleges. And as a result, close to 1,000 CUP members and fellow travelers were arrested and exiled. And then a year later, when the Armenian crisis was reopened following the Ottoman Bank takeover, the CUP, which was now being run by very high-ranking officials in the imperial government, were foiled in their coup attempt after their plans were leaked to the palace. The uncovering of this plot to overthrow the Sultan, which again involved some very high-ranking imperial bureaucrats and military officers, would lead to yet another massive campaign of arrests as hundreds of officers, administrators, and prominent intellectuals were apprehended and exiled. By the end of 1896, as things were finally beginning to calm down somewhat in the aftermath of the Hamidian massacres, the Sultan could once more breathe easy, knowing that he had successfully crushed all oppositional elements within his empire. But because he had just sent over 1,000 of his political opponents to Western Europe, North Africa, and the Balkans, the oppositional movement would not cease to exist, but would simply move locations. And now that these young Turks were no longer under the thumb of Abdul Hamid's secret police in Istanbul, they were free to write and say whatever they wanted to. And seeing as all of them had now been personally wronged by Abdul Hamid through the Sultan's campaign of arrests, the rhetoric of the Young Turks would become increasingly harsh and increasingly radical. The man who will emerge as the leader of this budding emigre movement of Ottoman exiles in Europe will be Ahmed Riza. Over the coming years, there will be many factional debates, party splits, personal rivalries, fierce backbiting, all the good oppositional party stuff. But through it all, Ahmed Riza will prove to have the most lasting power among the many different leaders of the CUP. And after the revolution of 1908, Ahmed Riza will be elected as the president of the newly inaugurated Chamber of Deputies, in recognition of his dominant position within the CUP leading up to the revolution. So, let's put Ahmed Riza onto the board. Ahmed Riza was born in 1858 to a very prominent Turkish family from Istanbul, as the son of a long line of influential men who had for many generations served in some of the highest levels of imperial government. Ahmed Riza's father, Ali Riza, was a powerful judge and diplomat who, throughout his long career, had been appointed to many different foreign posts that would take him all the way from Cairo to Vienna. Riza's father, Ali, became well known for his mastery of the English language, and he was often jokingly referred to as the Englishman because of his love of English culture. While serving in Vienna, Ali Riza met a young Hungarian woman named Fräulein Turban, and the two would fall in love, get married, and eventually move back to Istanbul in order to start a family, giving birth to Ahmed Riza in 1858. As a child within this elite family with very close ties to Western Europe, Ahmed Riza received a Western-style education at Istanbul's most prestigious high school. And the Rizas were kind of a little family of geniuses, as Ahmed's younger sister, Selma Riza, would one day become the very first female Turkish journalist after she joins her older brother in Paris in 1898. So, more on Selma Riza later. Upon graduating from this elite high school, Ahmed Riza quickly attained a job at the Sublime Porte as a translator. However, when Sultan Abdul Hamid dismissed the parliament in 1878 amidst the war with Russia and the chaos of the Great Eastern Crisis, Ahmed Riza's father, who had been a member of the First Ottoman Parliament and was closely associated with the reform-minded ministers surrounding Midhat Pasha, was exiled to a remote city in central Anatolia. For the young and impressionable Ahmed Riza, the experience of moving to the heartland of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia was a transformative moment. Even though his family lived quite comfortably in the city of Konya, Ahmed Riza was struck by the extreme level of poverty experienced by Turkish peasants in this more remote province of the empire. So, this experience inspired Ahmed Riza to want to study agriculture and a desire to help Ottomans develop more efficient and more modern ways of cultivating food so as to alleviate the sufferings of Ottoman peasants. In the early 1880s, Ahmed moved to Paris to study at an elite French university. And while in Paris, Riza was dazzled by French culture and intoxicated by the thriving intellectual life of the City of Lights. Ahmed would graduate 2 years later with a degree in agricultural engineering, and he then moved back to the Ottoman Empire in the hope of using his knowledge and expertise to help modernize the empire. However, around the time of his graduation, Riza's father passed away, and this made it much more difficult for the young Ahmed to secure a high-level job. So, Ahmed contacted the Ottoman Minister of Agriculture, but he was told that there were no jobs in agriculture, a response that greatly frustrated the ambitious young man who in fact could see many jobs that needed to be done in many different places. Ahmed Riza would eventually land a job as a chemistry teacher, but he became very disillusioned about the state of the Ottoman Empire, and he would resolve in 1889 to move back to Paris with the specific intention of establishing himself as an oppositional voice in the French capital. As we know, Ahmed Riza's decision to move to Paris so that he could safely criticize the Ottoman government from afar was not an unprecedented thing to do, as many young Ottomans like Namik Kemal and Ibrahim Shenasi, which, by the way, it is Shenasi, not Ibrahim Senyasi. Thank you, listener Sinan, for bringing that to my attention. But the young Ottomans had similarly moved to Europe once they grew frustrated by the lack of opportunities within the stagnating Ottoman Empire. In following this tradition of Ottoman intellectuals choosing a life of self-imposed exile, Ahmed Riza moved to Paris in 1889, and it's often noted that Ahmed arrived in Paris amidst the centennial celebrations of the French Revolution, as July 14, 1889 marked the 100th anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, the great precipitating event of the French Revolution. So, by moving to Paris, Riza was symbolically embracing the scientific, technological, and political advances of Western Europe. And when he arrived in the French capital, Riza quickly became a fairly prominent figure within the intellectual scene of Paris. And as a writer, he would become most well known for his work amongst the French positivists and for his very influential journal called Mejferet, which in time would become one of the central mouthpieces for the Young Turk movement. Almost immediately upon his arrival in France, Ahmed Riza had begun looking for a partner with whom he could start up some sort of publishing operation. And the man who would fill this role for Riza was a Maronite Christian from Beirut named Khalil Ghanem. Khalil Ghanem had been an influential translator and statesman in the Ottoman province of Mount Lebanon during the late Tanzimat era. The province of Mount Lebanon was, much like Macedonia and eastern Anatolia, a very ethnically and religiously diverse area with large populations of Christians, Muslims, Jews, and even a significant population of people practicing the small esoteric Abrahamic faith called the Druze. After a period of intense civil strife in 1860, which saw unprecedented levels of violence erupt between Maronite Christians and the Druze, Tanzimat leaders, along with representatives from the European powers, intervened in the Lebanon conflict and thereafter established a multi-ethnic and multi-religious council in which the different religious groups of Mount Lebanon would each elect officials to act on what was a relatively democratic council. As a young man, Alil Ghanem worked within this liberal-ish government of Ottoman Mount Lebanon, representing his community of Maronite Christians. And like Ahmed Riza's father, Ghanem had served in the first Ottoman parliament as a Lebanese delegate after Midhat Pasha's constitution was installed in 1876. And in a lot of ways, the structure of the Mount Lebanon province represented a possible way in which to reform the entire Ottoman Empire, to make it more inclusive and responsive to all of its diverse peoples. So much so that during the Congress of Berlin, when old Father Crimean, defender of the common Armenian, was making his case for establishing a multi-religious autonomous state in the Armenian provinces, Father Crimean specifically pointed to Mount Lebanon as a ready model for building a provincial government that would represent the interests of both Muslims and Christians. But of course, Abdul Hamid had not chosen the path of pluralism and representative government, but he instead suspended the constitution and disbanded the Ottoman parliament in 1878. And as a member of this first parliament, Alil Ghanem was forced to flee to Paris to escape the persecution of the reactionary sultan. While living in Paris throughout the 1880s, Alil Ghanem would be extremely prolific as a journalist and academic, serving as the editor for several different journals and newspapers in both Paris and Geneva, making his case for reinstituting the Midhat Constitution. So, as an Ottoman spending the 1880s as an exile in Paris, Ghanem represented a connective link between the earlier group of exiles amongst the young Ottomans of the 1870s and the later group of young Turks in exile in the 1890s. And then as a Maronite Christian, which was an eastern branch of Catholicism, Ghanem was also an important link between Ottoman Muslims and French intellectuals, as the French viewed the Maronites as a fellow Catholic community under French protection. So, for Ahmed Riza, Alil Ghanem was an ideal partner. Ghanem was a fierce opponent of Sultan Abdul Hamid, and he also had these close ties with the intellectual scene in France. But most importantly, Alil Ghanem was an Ottomanist. Like Ahmed Riza, Ghanem was a disciple of Midhat Pasha, and he was a fierce advocate for establishing a pluralistic society in the Ottoman Empire, taking the model of Mount Lebanon and applying it to the whole empire, with a parliamentary government that would give representation to all of the Sultan's subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim. And because Ghanem was a Christian Ottomanist, he was not only opposed to the reactionary turn of Abdul Hamid, but he was also opposed to sectarianism, and he was critical of Christian revolutionary nationalists who promoted separatism and who pushed for great power intervention. In other words, Alil Ghanem was a Christian unionist who wanted to preserve the Ottoman Empire by making it more open, cosmopolitan, and pluralistic, and he was wary of great power involvement in this process. Ahmed Riza was similarly an Ottomanist and a unionist, wishing to preserve the Ottoman Empire, while also promoting the equal representation of all Ottoman minority populations. And then Riza was also very wary of great power involvement in the reform process. Early leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress in Istanbul, such as Ibrahim Timo, would make contact with Ahmed Riza as early as 1889, when the party was first being founded and when Riza was moving back to Paris. But Riza would not officially join the party until 1895, when a CUP member named Dr. Nazim, who will be very important, remember Dr. Nazim, traveled to Paris to ask Ahmed Riza to become the leader of the new CUP branch in France. Like many Ottomans, Riza had become ever more critical of Sultan Abdul Hamid and his government over the past 5 years, and he had been voicing these criticisms in French newspapers, making him a well-known oppositional voice. As an emerging intellectual with close ties to the intellectual life of Paris, Riza was a logical choice to lead CUP operations in Europe. Ahmed Riza would eventually accept Dr. Nazim's offer, and in 1895, Ahmed Riza became the official leader of the European wing of the CUP. With his new position as the official leader of the Young Turk movement abroad, Ahmed Riza would come together with his Maronite Christian comrade, Alil Ghanem, to co-found the journal Mejferet, with the goal of creating a space where intellectuals from many different walks of life could freely discuss Ottoman affairs. During its time in publication, Mejferet would publish a wide range of voices, including many prominent Ottoman Muslims and Christians, as well as French intellectuals who shared Riza and Ghanem's desire to see the Ottoman Empire reformed and modernized. The title of the journal Mejferet means consultation, which is a reference to an Islamic concept in which community leaders are expected to consult with their community. So this was obviously a jab at Abdul Hamid, and the writers at Mejferet would slam the Sultan for not consulting the smart people of his empire, like themselves, who had the education needed to run the empire rationally. In late 1895, when hundreds of Ottoman exiles suddenly flooded into Paris and Geneva after the Sultan's series of arrests, Mejferet quickly transformed into the center of the entire oppositional movement against Abdul Hamid. As Ahmed Riza and Alil Ghanem welcomed this new wave of Ottoman exiles into Paris and Geneva, Mejferet emerged as the unofficial organ of the CUP. During its years of publication in the late 1890s, some of the most important voices in Mejferet would of course include its two primary editors, Ahmed Riza and Alil Ghanem, as well as important future leaders of the CUP, such as the man who would eventually become the primary ideologue of Turkism, Yusuf Akçura, as well as Dr. Nazim, who would in many ways become Ahmed Riza's right-hand man during this period. Another prominent voice in Mejferet was the CUP founder Abdullah Cevdet, who would write under the pen name The Kurd, as he not only pushed for constitutional reform and unity through Ottomanism, but also emerged as a voice within the nascent movement of early Kurdish nationalism. And then Dr. Nazim and Yusuf Akçura would also begin to formulate their form of proto-Turkish nationalism during their time writing for Mejferet. So the seeds of future division between the different nationalist movements were already present even in these early days. But with that being said, the main ideological undercurrent of Mejferet and the Young Turks more generally in the 1890s would remain constitutionalism and a push for greater unity within the empire through Ottomanism. At this point, nationalism was still second to Ottomanism. Even though Mejferet would include a diversity of voices, Ahmed Riza's idiosyncratic beliefs would still come to dominate the ideology of Mejferet, and so would have a major influence on the ideology of the entire oppositional movement. So we are now going to try and wrap our heads around these idiosyncratic beliefs. Our first stop in trying to understand Ahmed Riza's unique ideology is French sociology. So, before Ahmed Riza became the leader of the CUP, he had been very involved in the flourishing intellectual scene called French positivism, which had emerged in the wake of the very influential sociologist Auguste Comte. So, what in the world is positivism? And you know, hypothetical listener, you are asking the right question. Because in many of the books I have read on the Young Turks, the authors will just casually throw out, oh yeah, Ahmed Riza, he was a positivist, seemingly assuming that everyone knows all about this niche French philosophy from the 19th century. So, hypothetical listener, you are not alone. I also didn't really have any idea what positivism was, and to save you the time, here is what I have since found out. Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, was a French philosopher active in the first half of the 19th century, meaning that Comte was a product of the French Revolution. He had been a small child when Napoleon declared himself as the Emperor of France in 1804. He was a teenager during the Bourbon Restoration in 1815, after Napoleon had finally been defeated at Waterloo. He was in his 30s when the July Revolution overthrew the Bourbons and declared the Duc d'Orléans as Louis Philippe, King of the French. And he was 50 in 1848 when the February Revolution overthrew Louis Philippe and established the short-lived Second French Republic. And then I'm sure the 54-year-old Auguste Comte experienced some crazy historical whiplash when Louis Napoleon, the great general's weird, clownish nephew, declared himself as the second emperor of France in 1852, really bringing things full circle. So it is safe to say that Auguste Comte lived through a pretty tumultuous time, and his experience living in revolutionary France would have a major impact on his philosophy. As a young man, Comte worked as a secretary for the great French political theorist Henri de Saint-Simon. Henri de Saint-Simon is often pointed to as the founder of utopian socialism, and he was very influential on many different thinkers of the 19th century, such as the influential English liberal John Stuart Mill, the early French socialist Charles Fourier, the founder of anarchism Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and the early proponents of scientific socialism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Though Marx and Engels would characteristically be very critical of what they saw as the utopian fantasies of Saint-Simon. So, with this pioneering political theorist as his mentor, Auguste Comte would represent yet another branch of political thought growing out of the utopian socialism of Henri de Saint-Simon. Though much like Marx and Engels, Comte would also come to have some major beef with the utopianism of Saint-Simon, even if he ultimately saw it as having a lot of merit. As we just mentioned, Auguste Comte's time on Earth would be most defined by intense political turmoil and social instability, amidst the seemingly never-ending cycle of revolutions and counter-revolutions in France. And due to this experience, Comte essentially dedicated his life to developing a political philosophy that could bring an end to this social disorder, which he felt had been set off in 1789 by the French Revolution. And in this great mission to bring an end to social disorder, Auguste Comte would turn to science and rationalism as the best way in which to get everyone to just please calm down. And as a philosopher interested in using the methods of science to study human societies, Auguste Comte gets to go down as the founder of modern sociology. Though it is interesting to note here, especially within the context of our current series, that the scholar who is often pointed to as the pre-modern father of sociology was the Islamic scholar named Ibn Khaldun. And this is interesting for us because Ibn Khaldun would influence both Western European and Ottoman historians and philosophers. So this is the kind of thing that Islamic modernists are talking about when they argue that you can trace a continual through line from medieval Islamic philosophy up to the European Enlightenment. Even though Auguste Comte did not coin the term sociology, he would be the first modern thinker to try and define sociology as a field of study in which empiricism and the scientific method would be employed to study and improve human societies. And in his great project to use science to evolve humanity, Comte would come up with all sorts of crazy harebrained ideas, with one of his most well-known schemes being the religion of humanity, in which he tried to build a secular cult with a rational calendar and canon of saints that would worship all sorts of historical figures, from Shakespeare to Gutenberg to Moses. But for the positivists who would come to be disciples of Comte, like Ahmed Riza, one of Comte's most influential ideas was the so-called Law of Three Stages, which traced the intellectual evolution of the human species. So, Comte laid out three distinct phases of human thought. The first phase was the theological stage, which is what it sounds like. Most people just blindly follow what priests and kings tell them to do. The second phase was the metaphysical stage, which, somewhat misleadingly, actually describes the European Enlightenment, and especially European political thought after the French Revolution. Comte saw the Enlightenment's questioning of authority through placing ultimate power with the human race rather than with kings and priests as a very positive development. But he viewed things like universal human rights and liberty and freedom as overly abstract concepts. And so, for Comte, even though Enlightenment thinkers were correct in questioning arbitrary authority, they were still stuck in the trap of abstract metaphysics when they appealed to things like human rights. Comte felt that such abstract concepts were ultimately rooted in irrational human emotions and could not be verified through hard evidence. And because such concepts could not be derived through logic and reason, to Comte they were meaningless, and even potentially harmful in their focus on the rights of the individual over the collective good of a society, which Comte thought was bad. Comte's third and final stage of human development was the positive stage. And the English word positive in this case comes from the French word positif, which essentially means knowledge derived through direct experience of the material world. So, the positive stage emerges once humans realize that true knowledge can only be attained through logic backed by hard evidence. The positive stage can essentially be understood as the scientific stage. Humans move past the irrational metaphysics of both religion and overly abstract and individualistic political concepts like liberty and human rights. In the positive stage, the great benefits of scientific reasoning are brought to bear on human societies, and once humans only make decisions based on hard logic and evidence, societies can evolve to become more rational, stable, productive, and so they flourish. In other words, continuous scientific progress leads to continuous social evolution. This last point is important. Auguste Comte, unlike many of his contemporaries, was not a revolutionary. Yes, that's right. Positivism is an anti-revolutionary ideology. Auguste Comte hated Napoleon, and in fact, Napoleon was chosen by Comte as like his number one villain in his Religion of Humanity. Auguste Comte believed in a process of human evolution, not revolution. Societies should be changed through rational decision-making that is based on hard evidence. Politics should not be driven by emotional concepts like freedom, equality, human rights, liberation, etc. Such concepts are too abstract, and to Comte they are in fact completely meaningless because they have no basis in the material world. So when Auguste Comte died in 1857, he left in his wake a whole army of dedicated followers who set out to use Comte's newfangled method called sociology to solve all of the world's problems. When Ahmed Riza became active in the intellectual scene of Paris in the 1890s, he got super duper into Auguste Comte's brand of sociology and emerged as one of the foremost scholars of positivism in Paris. And you can kind of understand why Riza would be drawn to Auguste Comte, as Riza had himself grown up amidst a time of great unrest and social turmoil within the Ottoman Empire. Ahmed Riza would use his position as a well-established positivist intellectual to push for modernization and reform in Ottoman lands. And Riza's prominence as a scholar of positivism was one of the main reasons why he was chosen to lead the European branches of the CUP in 1895. And when he was elected as the CUP's leader, one of the main developments that occurred was that the CUP now suddenly had a much more clearly defined ideology. And as this ideology began to be published through the Meshferet Journal, it would come to be dominated by Riza's positivist beliefs. Now, even though the rise of Ahmed Riza and the establishment of Meshferet as the CUP's central organ did provide ideological coherence, this by no means meant that everyone in the opposition was suddenly all on the same page. Quite the opposite, actually. Many young Turks quickly became frustrated by Ahmed Riza's stubborn adherence to an anti-revolutionary stance. And this tension ultimately came down to a divide between those who sought to change society through evolution versus those who sought to change society through revolution. Now, interestingly, those in the Ottoman opposition who would chafe against Ahmed Riza's more moderate policies and who would push for a more activist approach would come on the one hand from exiled military officers and Islamic religious scholars who wanted to launch a coup against Abdul Hamid, and then on the other hand from the Armenian revolutionaries like the Hunchaks and the Dashnaks. To start with the military officers and Islamic religious scholars. So, as we have talked about, leading up to and following the failed coup of 1896, more and more people were being sent into exile. And since the CUP in Istanbul had been briefly taken over by high-ranking bureaucrats, military officers, and religious scholars, this meant that more and more exiles in Europe were now high-ranking bureaucrats, military officers, and religious scholars. This fundamentally changed the makeup of the Young Turk immigrant movement, as it came to be dominated by these bureaucrats, officers, and scholars, who were quite different in outlook and demeanor than the brainy, westernized intellectuals like Ahmed Riza and Ali al-Ghanem. These high-ranking officials came from the world of palace conspiracy, and so for them, the goal was to depose Abdul Hamid. I mean, they had just tried to pull off a coup in 1896 and had nearly succeeded until they were ratted out. This activist group wanted to launch another coup against the Sultan. Ahmed Riza fervently argued against such a coup because he felt that it would only cause chaos and disorder without bringing about any real change. And though Ahmed Riza kind of had a good point here, this anti-activist position made him increasingly unpopular amongst these new immigrants who now represented the majority of exiled Young Turks, and who wanted to take action against Abdul Hamid right now. I mean, what are we waiting on? And then the other activist camp, way on the other side of the political spectrum, were the Armenian revolutionaries. Now, obviously, we have talked a lot about the Hunchaks and the Dashnaks, and both of the Armenian parties would emerge in the mid-1890s as very prominent voices within immigrant circles in Paris and Geneva. And this rise to prominence of the Armenian committees largely grew out of the Hamidian massacres, which caused a real sensation in Europe. As the Hamidian massacres only got worse and worse, one of the primary political aims of the Dashnaks and the Hunchaks became that of trying to increase awareness in Europe of the terrible condition of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Abdul Hamid. And seeing as their family, friends, and countrymen were being massacred by the tens of thousands, obviously the Dashnaks and the Hunchaks were pushing for more of an activist approach. But for the Armenian revolutionaries, many of whom were socialists and Marxists, a coup was not enough. A full-blown political and social revolution needed to be launched within the empire. It was not enough to simply dethrone Abdul Hamid and replace him with another member of the Ottoman dynasty. Ottoman society needed to be fundamentally transformed. So, to the far right of Ahmed Riza were the exiled officers, bureaucrats, and religious scholars, and to his far left were the Armenian revolutionaries. So, Ahmed Riza and his group at Meshvret continued to push for gradual and moderate reforms that would evolve Ottoman society in a nice, orderly manner, saying, let's just be patient, you guys. And well, with this moderate approach, Ahmed Riza and his crew quickly lost their hold over the Ottoman immigrant scene in Europe, who were all rearing to go. So, for a brief period of time beginning in the fall of 1896, the CUP would come under the leadership of a prominent journalist named Minzani Murad Bey. Since the 1880s, Minzani Murad had been publishing an oppositional newspaper called Mizan, which means balance, and which is where he got his nickname Minzani, the Balancer. Now, as this nickname suggests, Minzani Murad was himself pretty moderate in his beliefs, and he pushed for many of the same things that Ahmed Riza did, including the reestablishment of the 1876 Midhat Constitution, a focus on unity through Ottomanism, and a desire to form a government based around meritocracy instead of personal favor with the Sultan. And like many other prominent Ottoman intellectuals, Minzani Murad had been sent into exile in 1895, and as a well-known oppositional journalist, Minzani Murad immediately made a splash when he arrived in Europe. Even though he shared a lot of the same moderate views as Ahmed Riza, Minzani Murad was a bit less ideologically stubborn, and he would attempt to forge alliances with a very diverse array of people, ranging from the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, to members of the Armenian revolutionary groups. Mizani Murad would begin his exile in Cairo, as he moved the headquarters of his Mizan newspaper to Egypt in late 1895. And as more and more exiles began pouring into Cairo, a movement happening parallel to the arrival of exiles in Paris and Geneva, Mizani Murad would be elected as the leader of the Cairo branch of the CUP, just after Ahmed Riza was elected to lead the CUP as a whole. And Mizani Murad would basically begin to publish Mizan as a rival journal to Ahmed Riza's Mejferet. And through the pages of Mizan, Mizani Murad quickly gained popularity amongst the Young Turks. And Mizan even began to eclipse Mejferet in popularity, especially within the Ottoman Empire itself. And this popularity of Mizani Murad, in a lot of ways, had more to do with Ahmed Riza's stubborn clinging to the positivist credo of gradual social evolution, really more than anything else. Because even though Mizani Murad was still pretty moderate, he was not so stubbornly opposed to revolutions and coups. So, with the rise of a new, powerful voice offering a more activist vision for the opposition, many Young Turks began calling for Mizani Murad to replace Ahmed Riza as their leader. And a good number of these Young Turks, now opposed to Riza, actually worked at Riza's newspaper Mejferet, as these writers began comparing Riza's tight control over the paper with Abdul Hamid's tight control over the empire. So, with these critiques of the positivist leader now circulating in Europe, Mizani Murad decided to officially challenge Ahmed Riza, and he left Cairo for Europe in the fall of 1896. When Mizani Murad arrived in Paris, the members of the European branches quickly jumped at the chance to stop Ahmed Riza's tightening grip over the CUP. And Mizani Murad was elected as the overall leader of the CUP in November of 1896. However, Mizani Murad would take control of the CUP during a very tumultuous time, following the Ottoman Bank takeover, the Istanbul pogrom, the failed 1896 coup, and the mass exodus of bureaucrats, military officers, and religious scholars to Europe. After moving the headquarters of the CUP to Geneva, leaving Ahmed Riza and his followers at Mejferet behind in Paris, Mizani Murad began appealing to high-ranking diplomats and government officials within both the Ottoman administration and within the governments of Europe, most especially Great Britain. This strategy was twofold. First, Mizani Murad hoped to convince ministers and military officers within the Sultan's inner circle to launch a coup against Abdul Hamid. Second, Mizani Murad wanted to gain the support of a foreign great power, ideally the British, to help him dethrone Abdul Hamid. Now, this second point, the desire to prompt a great power to intervene and depose Abdul Hamid on behalf of the opposition, will eventually become the great split within the Ottoman opposition movement. This split will fully ripen at the First Congress of the Ottoman opposition in 1902. But amidst the apocalyptic chaos of 1896, a lot of Young Turks would follow Mizani Murad in his effort to prompt a great power intervention. And it would really only be Ahmed Riza and his circle who would fiercely denounce the involvement of a great power. And in the coming years, Ahmed Riza will continue to fiercely denounce the involvement of European powers. And in many ways, this stubborn refusal to ever even entertain the idea of involving the great powers in the internal politics of the Ottoman Empire will be the thing that will give Ahmed Riza lasting popularity within the movement. Because more and more Young Turks will eventually come to understand that the great powers really only had their own interests in mind, and they will begin to cool on the idea of involving the great powers in the effort to reform the empire. But for now, Mizani Murad's openness to great power involvement and to a coup made him pretty popular, especially amongst the more radical elements on both sides of the divide, from the Armenian revolutionaries hoping to establish autonomy in eastern Anatolia, on over to the disaffected military officers hoping to restore Ottoman honor. None of Mizani Murad's plans would come to be realized, and in the end, his leadership would last less than a year. The quick decline of Mizani Murad would be precipitated by larger events, specifically by the outbreak of war between the Ottoman Empire and Greece. Now, we are going to eventually talk more about the Greco-Turkish War of 1897 because it will have some ramifications, specifically surrounding the Macedonian struggle that will trigger the revolution. But for now, it is enough to know that a war broke out in April of 1897 between the Ottomans and Greeks over the island of Crete, which had basically been in a constant state of rebellion for like 100 years. And well, the Ottomans trounced the Greeks in this war, using their newly modernized army to good use. And even though the settlement after this war would be complex and would involve these scheming great powers, the war was a glorious victory for the Ottomans, and so a glorious victory for Abdul Hamid. The Sultan would make great use of this glorious victory as a propaganda device, and he began to paint the CUP and other oppositional elements as unpatriotic. So, the Greco-Turkish War would be very deflating for the Ottoman opposition movement, as people began talking less about the despotic tyranny of the Red Sultan and more about the great triumph of the Ottoman army, which had finally been pulled into the modern age by Abdul Hamid. And knowing that he was now in a position of power, Abdul Hamid decided that it was high time to make another move against the CUP. But this time around, the ever-adroit Abdul Hamid would not try to repress the Young Turks, as he had done in 1895 and 1896, but instead he would try to lure them back into the empire, inviting them to join his government and accept the security of a nice, cushy salary working for the Ottoman administration. And well, this scheme of Abdul Hamid's to lure the Young Turks back to his side would work fairly well, as the Sultan's childhood friend and agent, a man named Ahmed Riza, would begin handing out deals to all sorts of Young Turks living in Paris, Geneva, and Cairo. And so people began dropping like flies, as more and more Young Turks would defect back to the Sultan's side. So people began taking bribes to halt their publications, which spoke against the Sultan. People sold their oppositional journals to the Ottoman government, and people even began accepting positions to once more work for the Sultan's government. The biggest defection would come in July of 1897, when Mizani Murad himself accepted an offer of over 500,000 francs to buy out his newspaper, Mizan, as the Ottoman government purchased their printing plant, bought all back orders of the paper, and offered a general amnesty for anyone who worked at Mizan. Many people at the time thought that this was the end of the Young Turk movement. I mean, the leader of the CUP had just defected back to the Sultan's camp. But even though this mass exodus of Young Turks from Europe back into the empire would be devastating for the opposition movement, it would certainly not be the end. And after the Geneva branch under Mizani Murad sold out to the Sultan, the primary effect was that it weeded out all of the posers who had only joined the CUP because they had become unemployed after the Sultan's Great Purge. And now that they were offered their old jobs, these people quickly took the opportunity to go home. But Ahmed Riza had been living in Paris as an exile for almost 10 years. Ahmed Riza was not about to sell out to the Sultan just because he had won a little war against the Greeks and was offering him a nice pension. So Ahmed Riza and his circle at Meshfret would refuse the offers of the Sultan's agent Ahmed Jalaluddin. And ultimately, this refusal to be bought out by the Sultan would make Ahmed Riza popular once more amongst the Young Turks. Because for those who decided to remain in exile, Mizani Murad was now derided as a turncoat, while Ahmed Riza was praised for his principled stand against the Sultan. After the defection of Mizani Murad and his circle, the Young Turk movement would enter into a new phase in which the opposition would become increasingly scattered. And in this period of hibernation, there would be three main camps. First was the Paris circle around Ahmed Riza at Meshfret. This would include Alil Ghanem, Abdullah Cevdet, Dr. Nazim, and by 1899, a young Yusuf Akçura, who was now beginning to articulate his new ideology of Turkism. Second were the Armenian revolutionary groups, specifically the Dashnaks and the Hunchaks, who would continue to operate in Geneva, Tiflis, Paris, and within the Ottoman Empire itself, where Armenian Fedayeen would carry on a low-grade war against the administration through the 1890s and into the early 1900s, always representing the radical edge of the opposition movement. And then third is the group we will be turning our focus to next week. And this is the opposition circle in Cairo. As we mentioned, before taking leadership of the CUP, Menzani Murad had first established himself in Cairo. And well, this move of Menzani Murad had transformed the Cairo branch into a critical center of CUP operations, mostly because publications could easily be smuggled into the empire through Cairo, as Egypt was under the dual sovereignty of the Ottomans and the British. This offered distinct advantages because opposition figures in Cairo could more freely express their ideas under the protection of the British, but they could also more easily reach the Ottoman public by way of the many connections running between Cairo and Istanbul. And well, after the departure of Menzani Murad, the Cairo branch of the CUP would be taken over by religious scholars based in Cairo at the Al-Azhar University. And for a time, the Cairo branch would officially take control of the entire CUP, meaning that the CUP would briefly be under the leadership of these Cairo religious scholars. So the Cairo wing would represent yet another angle within the swirling debates happening amongst the Young Turks, meaning that next week we will be doing a deep dive into the lives and philosophies of some very important figures within the history of Islamic thought: Jamal al-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu. So next episode is going to be a lot of fun, and you won't want to miss it. So join me as we begin our discussion of one of the most important ideological movements of the entire 20th century, Islamic modernism.